Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for taking your time to spend the afternoon with us. Again, my name is Brian Kluge. I'm the Director of P&A Products, and my main responsibility is overseeing the service and P&A organization for Select Products, mainly the engine care products. We wanted to spend a little time with you today and give you the OEM's perspective on ethanol, the myths of ethanol, and just fuel care in general. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce other individuals on the phone today. I apologize. It looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Okay, here we go. In the room with me are Frank Kelly, who is the resident expert for all things related to oil, lubrication, and fuel management. Next, we have Ed Alienek, who handles testing protocol and what I believe is having one of the most fun jobs within the organization. Because at the end of the day, he's the gentleman who tries to blow up stuff and really tax our engines and make them better for all of our customers. Next, we have Mr. Mark Rickers, who is the technical liaison and handles technical liaison activities with trade associations, government entities, and competitors, and generally works with other competitors to make sure and ensure that we are all pulling in the same direction from a regulatory perspective. And lastly but not least, we have Heidi Stark, who's the product manager for P&A Products. She's been with the company for 13 years and is focused mainly on engine care products for Mercury Marine. So you look at the slide and you look at the technical expertise. In this room we have nearly 100 years of technical experience, and if you really think about it, they are backed behind many other engineers who have a similar amount of experience, and that is backed by tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of engine test hours backing up the comments that they make. On the next slide here, just to give you a flavor of what we want to discuss today, obviously we have the general topic overview, and really what we'll do is we'll start with the end first and really steal some of the thunder from the presentation for those that are very busy and don't have time to sit through the entire hour with us. Next, Mark will spend a few minutes on an E10 refresher or primer, and then also talk about the latest update on E15. Then next we'll have Ed Alienek and Frank Kelly discuss this general fuel care and the technical aspects of fuel care. Then we'll have Heidi come in and talk about the major myths and misconceptions about fuel care and ethanol in general. And then we'll wrap it up with a summary, and that's where I invite everybody to ask questions, because the last 15 minutes we'll be sure to spend some time answering questions that you may have. Also, I want to note that sprinkled in this presentation is E0, E10, and E0 obviously is non-ethanol fuel, E10 is 10% ethanol, and then in fact E15 would be 15% ethanol. And I also have to apologize in advance for the amount of wordiness in our presentation. We wanted to make sure that this presentation could stand on its own because this we view as a good reference document for the future. On the next slide here, we have the fuel care takeaways, and really just very quickly talk about the fact that when you look at ethanol in general, you really have to parse it into three different issues, obviously E10, E15, and general fuel care, and really talk about the fact that ethanol has become a catch-all phrase for problems out there as it relates to fuel care issues. Next, really want to talk through the fact that this particular category needs a good source of truth in the marketplace, because what we're really dealing with is not rocket science issues, and it really does not need rocket science cures. And then Ed will talk about core technical issues. You can see very simple, basic issues as it relates to fuel care that really, again, are not rocket science. Next, a bottle of X, whatever it may be, will never solve 100% of the issues, and it's really all about prevention on the front side, whether it's the bottle of fluid, fuel care products, or other mechanical things that you can do. And lastly, and most importantly, buyer beware, and our mantra here is resist the myths. A healthy dose of skepticism is good, especially with dealing with aftermarket companies whose sole purpose maybe is not necessarily engine integrity, and it's to sell a bottle of fluid. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Mark, who will give us a quick primer on E10 and E15.
Okay, well, just to kind of get everybody on the same page, ethanol, where it originally was required, was used as an oxygenate in gasoline, and EPA's mandated that oxygenates be used in areas that have high pollution levels because it does help reduce hydrocarbon emissions. There was another oxygenate out there. It was called MTBE for a variety of reasons. It is no longer on the market. So ethanol is basically the only oxygenate out there. E10 has been used in the Midwest for many, many years, and because of that, marine engines, and for that matter, all engines, cars, lawnmowers, everything, are compatible with E10. There's no reason on any modern engine that you cannot use E10. One of the things you may not realize is that you may be dispensing E10 when you don't know it, because not all states require that the pumps be labeled. So you may be dispensing E10 and thinking you're getting 100% gasoline. E10 can actually be a superior fuel. It will take small quantities of water that inherently get in fuel tanks, and it will help run that through the engine without any problems. And, ethanol is a domestically produced fuel, so it can help reduce our dependence on foreign oil. We, Mercury Marine, are not against ethanol. We just want it used properly. And we do absolutely support a need for a well-designed and implemented national strategy to reduce our dependence on oil. Now, E15 you may have heard a lot about lately, and the ethanol industry really pushed for E15 to be approved, partially due to the renewable fuel standard which Congress passed, and partly because of business interests. EPA approved E15, but only for 2001 and newer cars and trucks under some fairly strict guidelines. Okay, it's important to note E15 is not approved for marine engines. It's not approved for small engines, motorcycles, older cars. And even though it has been approved, many of the OEMs in the auto industry and the marine industry are opposed to E15, basically due to concerns with increased emissions and the possibility of engine damage. I put on the screen a copy of what EPA's required E15 label is. The good thing is it's not out there very much right now, if at all. If you see this label, don't use that fuel in a marine engine. That's the bottom line. Okay, just a kind of an update on where E15 is going and the issues around it. Several entities, including the marine industry, have filed suits against EPA to repeal the E15 decision for a variety of reasons, mostly that there's insufficient knowledge and testing as to what it's going to do out there. Those lawsuits are likely to be heard this fall. We don't know anything further than an approximate. There's also some members of Congress that have been trying to repeal E15 or not let EPA spend any money to implement E15. There again, the timing is unknown on that, but it's been getting a lot of airplay. As I said before, E15 is not out there in any quantity right now. And the big thing is if you're in an area, especially in the Midwest, that's where it's most likely to show up. And just keep an eye out for that label, because that label is mandatory. And finally, there has been some renewed interest in some other fuel alternatives. One of them that looks promising is butanol, which is made very similar to ethanol, but seems to have a few better properties. So there's a lot of hurdles before E15 becomes mainstream. Just keep an eye out for it, and if you start to see it in your area, be sure your customers understand that that is not to be used in marine engines and not to be used in boats. And on that note,
thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate that. The next slide here, really the balance of the presentation will really relate solely to E0 and E10 fuels now. So just wanted to make sure that everybody's aware of that. Before I hand it over to Ed, who will talk about the technical aspects of fuel care, you'll see three advertisements, and actually these advertisements were run earlier this year, and really they were done as a response, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, as again, a response to some of the claims and comments and opinions that were out there in the marketplace. So really, again, it's a tongue-in-cheek, supposed to be a semi-comical response to what we really believe is a very serious issue. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ed, who will talk about the technical aspects of all fuel care.
Okay, before we can talk in detail about some of the myths that surround E10, we got to go through some of the basic background of fuel care and some of the reasons why E10 can create problems, because if not cared for properly, it can be a problem. We're going to talk about gasoline here today. We're not talking about diesel fuel, and we're talking about general fuel care. So we're not talking about special use things like octane enhancers or lead additives or those things, because those aren't generally in use by the boating public. If we look at fuel care, they fall into three areas: cleaners, stabilizers, and freeze preventers. Our cleaners are products out there. They're basically solvents that are added to fuel to clear deposits out of the fuel system, fuel tank, and out of the engine. They may be concentrated or they may be long use. Some are very short-term cleanup, some are intended for use season long. Then we have stabilizers. A stabilizer is a combination of antioxidants to reduce the rate that fuels oxidize. We usually call that souring for gasoline over time. This is for storage when fuel is going to be stored and not used for several months, and can be used during the season also, because they're never going to do any harm. They'll just help stabilize fuel. There's also corrosion inhibitors and stabilizers that help reduce the rate of corrosion in the fuel system. And then freeze preventers, traditionally you'll see products that are methanol or isopropyl alcohol. Isopropyl is usually used in diesel but can be used in gasoline. But what they do is they combine with the water in the bottom of a fuel tank and depress the freeze point of the water. Actually, what you're doing when you do that is you're creating a phase separation. That alcohol is going in the water in the bottom of the fuel tank. It's not causing the water to be dissolved into the fuel. So when you see claims for things that do other things, just broad fix-all claims, you really have to look at that with suspicion. Now, gasoline degrades over time, and that's one of the key reasons why we have to follow proper fuel care procedures in the maintenance of our engines and the maintenance of our vessels. Gasoline degrades from evaporation, contamination, and oxidation. Evaporation is very simple in that the light ends of the fuel just evaporate away. We generally have vented fuel tanks. At least we do now in most of our products. Fuel that is slightly evaporated is not going to harm any engine, it may cause a little bit of a cold starting issue because it's depressed a little in its light ends. Contamination is a serious issue in boating, primarily from water. We get water in the fuel that then can cause freezing, and larger amounts of water can create problems with E10 when we get into phase separation. Most of the water in a well-maintained system enters through condensation. We'll talk about that more a little bit later, but the water comes in humid air as things heat and cool over time and condenses on the walls of the fuel tank and then run down underneath the fuel. Oxidation is a process where the fuel basically picks up oxygen and forms new compounds. They'll come out as gums, sludges, and some slightly acidic deposits. When this happens, the gasoline can get a sour odor, and we usually call it sour gas. It can be discolored. There may be particles of gum suspended in the gas. Oxidized gasoline is never good in an engine. It's going to tend to clog filters. It's degraded and should never be run through an engine. It can be reduced, of course, with stabilizers, which slow down the rate of oxidation. But there really is no chemical additive that can return oxidized fuel to usable form. So any additive that makes that claim, it's just not true. We'll talk a little bit about phase separation with E10 fuel. When E10 or 10% ethanol gasoline comes in contact with water, the ethanol allows the water to dissolve into the gas up to some level. Pure gasoline, E0, can hold almost no water. It's virtually zero. But when you have E10, it can hold about 0.5% by volume water, which what that means is in a 20-gallon fuel tank, it can hold about 12 ounces of water. So if you think about the size of a pop can, 12 ounces, that's about the amount of water at 60 degrees Fahrenheit that E10 can hold with 20 gallons. Now, when you get over that amount of water, the water dissolved in the gas will come out of solution with the ethanol and fall to the bottom of the tank because it's more dense as a combination of water and the alcohol. That upper gasoline layer will be depleted of the ethanol, so it's going to drop in its octane level, and the lower phase separation layer is going to be a mix of water and ethanol, both of which can be somewhat corrosive. It may be 50-50 water and alcohol. So some of the things to think about is once phase separation has occurred, there is nothing you can add to the gasoline in any quantity that's reasonable that you would want going through an engine that's going to put those separated layers back together. And before phase separation, there's no magic, product that you can add to gasoline to stop this process. It's the nature of the gasoline when it's E10. So if you see products out there that claim to stop phase separation, it's not true. You can reduce the rate of separation by adding more alcohol, because as you add more alcohol, the gasoline can absorb more water. But you can never turn off the phase separation. The most likely time to have problems with E10 is when we transition from E0 to E10. Here in the Midwest, we've been burning E10 gasoline for about 30 years. We see very few, if any, problems with E10 gasoline, even in the marine environment. We run it all the time. We have for a long time. The transition is long since passed. In areas in the East Coast and Southeast Coast where the transition has been more recent, we hear of a lot of problems. One of the key reasons this occurs, I show in the little diagram here, is that if you've got E0 in your fuel tank, you're going to have water on the bottom of the fuel tank. That's just a fact. The water will collect and be maintained at a level where the fuel pickup pulls it in small amounts and it moves through the fuel system in droplets. It's these droplets that would get caught in a fuel line and freeze that cause gas line freeze-up in the traditional sense. Now, also you're going to have deposits build up in the fuel tank because of oxidation and some contamination and things over time. But things that with the E0 reach a steady state situation where the system is stable and happy, if you will. When now all of a sudden you add E10 to that fuel tank, you've added a certain volume of ethanol to the fuel tank. You've added a new solvent to the fuel tank now. The ethanol will tend to dissolve some of the deposits that may have collected in the fuel tank and the fuel system that were stable with the E0. Also, because you've added a small percentage of ethanol, your likelihood for phase separation is very high. And then that alcohol will fall out of the fuel into the water below because there'll be too much water to stay dissolved in the fuel. And you'll get a layer now that's going to get deeper because you've added the alcohol to it. And now that layer may be deep enough where the fuel pickup screen is down in under that water. And you'll get that combination of water and ethanol being drawn into the engine, and gasoline engines are not going to be happy running on it. So when we transition to E10 fuel, we really have to be careful, if possible, to look for presence of water in the fuel tank and to inspect the water separating filter for evidence of water. If water's found, we need to pump out fuel tanks before the separation. Try to clean out the fuel tanks if you can. It's difficult to do. Take a look at the fuel that's being taken out of them, especially the last bit of fuel, and see in a clear jar, does it look clear, or does it look cloudy, yellowy, milky, or does it have little bits of particles floating in it? These are all indications that you really need to do your best to clean the fuel tank before E10 is added. Then it's good practice to add a cleaner at this point because it'll help dissolve buildups of deposits, and then completely fill the fuel tank with E10 because we want to maximize the amount of alcohol in the tank so we can pick up the water and hold it in solution. It's always good practice to have extra filters on board in case after a period of time they start to plug and a filter change is required. The other key time for problems with E10 is during seasonal storage. During storage, fuel's going to oxidize, so of course we talk about adding stabilizing agents to the fuel. But the water holding capacity of E10 is greatly reduced with reducing temperature. We show here in the little graph, we can hold about 0.5% of water. That was the 1 can or 12 ounces per 20 gallons at 60 degrees, but that drops down to about 2/3 of that when you drop down to 20 degrees. So you can have a system that's very happy in the fall, but during the winter will phase separate if you're storing in that situation. So you've got to be aware during seasonal storage what you're doing. And we give some instructions and information in our operation and maintenance and warranty manuals for these things, but if possible, we recommend that people store with full fuel tanks, add a fuel stabilizer like Quick Store to the fuel, run the engine to get it into the fuel system, top off the tank, and store engines that way over the winter. Now, some areas require you to empty tanks also, and so you've got to do what you need to do to get tanks empty, and usually those facilities have ways that they pump the fuel out of the fuel lines that would run to the engines. You have to watch for other sources of water intrusion or just plain bad fuel. You know, there are low-quality sources of fuel. It's important to buy fuel where large volumes of fuel are sold. You know, obviously, if an area looks questionable where people are buying fuel, they should avoid it. You know, things like fuel caps and vents and things have to be properly cared for on boats in order to avoid water contamination, because if you got water coming in the fuel cap, you're going to pick up a lot of water in the fuel tank. You're going to phase separate if you run an E10 and create quite a problem. So it's important to keep good maintenance of equipment. At this point,
thank you very much, Ed. I appreciate that. Just want to, as a reminder, to let everybody know that we are taking questions toward the end of the presentation, or after the end of the presentation, sorry. And you can submit your questions using the Q&A box on your screen. So at this point, let me hand over the presentation to Heidi Stark, who will talk about the fuel care myth.
Now that we've gone over some of the technical issues regarding ethanol, we know what it is, where it comes from, and what some of the issues are when you're transitioning from a non-ethanol fuel to ethanol fuel, I'd like to apply some of that knowledge to some of the myths that are circulating in the marketplace regarding this type of fuel. The first myth is that fuel additives can cure or prevent all issues associated with ethanol blended fuel. There is no fuel additive that can prevent ethanol from acting as a solvent. As we talked about earlier, the best way is to drain and clean your tank prior to switching over to E10 to make sure to minimize some of your issues. Secondly, no matter how revolutionary a product claims to be, there is no product that's going to prevent all issues from occurring. The best solutions are a combination of non-additive and additive to help with some of these issues. And lastly, ethanol isn't necessarily the cause of all fuel system issues. We need to do our due diligence in troubleshooting properly and not assume that all fuel-related issues are as a result of ethanol. Another myth is that fuel additives can make stale or phase-separated fuel usable. To put this in a different way, you can use the analogy of spoiled milk. If you have half a gallon of curdled milk in your refrigerator, you're not going to buy fresh milk, add it to the spoiled milk to make it usable again. The same thing holds true with fuel. If you've got fuel that's been oxidized or separated, there's nothing you can add to make that fuel fresh again. The difference being with fuel, there's additives that can help prevent it from going bad. Another myth is that ethanol blended fuels are bad and should be avoided. Although E0 is generally preferred, there are some areas of the country where only E10 is available. For over 10 years, marine engines have been manufactured and engineered to be able to handle E10 gasoline. As we mentioned earlier, most of the issues are going to occur when you transition from E0 to E10. But after that transition is complete, E10 may actually be more helpful in keeping your fuel system dry. Another myth is that E10, the ethanol in E10, pulls water directly out of the air. Most of the water that's going to collect in your fuel tank is going to be due to condensation, not from ethanol pulling water out of the air. The last myth is that modern chemical breakthroughs have changed the way fuel treatments work. Engine manufacturers know how internal combustion engines work. They know how fuel works. There's a lot of big oil companies that have also done lots of research on the way gasoline works through an engine, and if there's anything that would be new technology, it would have been in the marketplace by now. Claims made by companies that are specializing in revolutionary technology or something that is new should be looked at with a high degree of suspicion. As we covered earlier, marine fuel additives are either going to clean or stabilize the fuel in your engine. So if they're claiming anything else, be wary. some of the products that we have and other OEMs have equivalents are products to maintain the cleanliness and stabilize fuel. So there's products out there that do a combination of preventing stabilization during the year and then also do some cleaning. There's also, we have a deep cleaning product called Quick Clean, which is for engines that might have been neglected for a period of time or that may have a lot of carbon buildup and need to be cleaned out. And then also there are fuel stabilizers that you can use during the storage period, and that will help prevent your fuel from corroding and oxidizing during long storage.
Great. Thank you very much, Heidi. I appreciate that. As you can see, we are covering a lot of information in a very short amount of time. And again, just to make everybody aware that we are making this presentation and webinar available for download. So again, you can use it as a reference document. Also, sources of information on the web. The best sources of information, of course, are from the OEM. And also just be wary of the sources of truth and where you're getting that information from. You know, as we all know, this is a very hot topic. It's a very sensitive topic and a somewhat political topic. So just be aware of the sources of information and where you're getting it from. And again, using that healthy dose of caution. So in summary, just to highlight some of the things that we've already spoken about, although E0 is recommended, E10 ethanol fuel is absolutely an acceptable fuel for everyday use. As Mark had mentioned, E15 absolutely is not an acceptable fuel for use. Talking about the myths out there and the far-reaching claims being made by companies, either knowingly or unknowingly. Again, we don't want to bash too many aftermarket companies because there are very good aftermarket companies out there, some of which may just not know the issue in depth and may unknowingly be creating customer confusion and frustration out there. Again, a bottle of whatever you're using will never solve 100% of the issues. Please make sure that taking time during that initial conversion from E0, taking that extra care and precaution. Very important, don't immediately assume E10 is the problem. Ethanol has enough issues going on with it. It being bashed when it really isn't the core issue certainly doesn't help any of us in this industry. And then lastly, all gasoline types need prevention, whether it's E0 or E10. So that concludes our formal presentation. At this point, I'd like to open up the Q&A portion, and while we've been speaking, a number of questions have come in. So we'll take just a minute to gather those questions, and we'll answer them right now. So the first question that came in was, what year do you consider a modern engine? I believe that relates to the fact where we say that modern engines today are designed to handle E10. So Frank or Ed or Mark, if you could answer that question for me, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, this is Frank Kelly, and I'll take a shot at answering that one. By modern engines, I think what we're referring to are engines that are have been built since about 1990. The transition from no ethanol and gasoline to E10 started to occur back in the 80s and mostly in the automotive world, but has carried over into the marine world as well. Mercury considers engines that we've built since 1995 to be fully compatible with E10. And so engines from the early 90s on you can consider to be the modern type engines that have been developed with E10 in mind.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. The next question we have states, oxidized fuel will oxidize the aluminum parts of fuel system and damage those parts. Is that correct?
Well, I'll take that one again. Oxidized fuel and oxidation of aluminum, really they're both similar processes that have occurred from the oxygen that is free oxygen, actually, for the most part, that's in the fuel. Fuel oxidizes as a result of its contact with oxygen, and aluminum oxidizes as well, also as a consequence of the contact with oxygen. Both are degradation processes, and both can lead to problems. I think that, where is the question at? Sorry. Where is it?
The oxidation of aluminum parts in the fuel system and damage to those parts?
And damage, that was the other question. As far as the damage that can result as a consequence of the oxidation that occurs, the two actually don't have any interaction so much. When fuel oxidizes, for example, you do get some acidic compounds that are also formed, and those acidic compounds can participate in some further corrosion of the aluminum, and that may lead to further damage of aluminum components. However, the amount of damage that occurs is really a function of all of the overall conditions that occur.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. Next question I have here is, does all gasoline have alcohol in it as an oxidizer?
I think that what the question might be here is that there is an oxygenator, or to add oxygen rather than an oxidizer. And no, all gasoline doesn't. It's typical in E10, we add the EPA allows the addition or even requires the addition of the alcohol to oxygenate the fuel. And what that does is make the fuel run with a higher oxygen content in the engine. It effectively leans out the burning of the fuel. I don't know, Mark, do you have a comment on that?
Well, right now in the U.S., E10 is probably in about 3/4 of the markets. Probably the biggest area that you will not find E10 tends to be the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, some of those states. But throughout the Midwest, the northern West Coast, and the whole East Coast, E10 is very predominant. Now, you will find in areas that EPA does not require it, you may find some stations that specifically advertise that they don't have any ethanol content in their fuels. The labeling for that is not consistent, so there's no mandated label that says no ethanol. So you pretty much have to look at the pumps and look at the station. And in fact, there's some stations that they will have E10 in regular and mid-grade, and then their premium will have no ethanol. So you've pretty much got to read the labeling. And if you're in an area that it's not required to be labeled, it's more of a challenge.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. As long as you are talking, a question came in regarding E15, and the question is this. If E15 is consumed for a period of time, how will engine performance be affected, i.e. stalling, heavy surge, etc.? If the engine is continued to be operated with E15, what damage may occur, i.e. knocking, piston damage, cylinder damage? If you could elaborate, that would be appreciated.
You want me to talk about that a little bit? This is Ed Alyanak. What we've done when we've gone from E10 to E15 is we've added more oxygenator to the fuel. So the fuel as it burns will create more oxygen in the combustion process. What happens then is the engine runs leaner. As a gasoline engine leans out, it runs hotter. So we're running higher exhaust temps, higher exhaust valve temps, higher in-cylinder temps, and over time that can take a toll on the engine. That is probably the main concern over the increase from E10 to E15. We design and test our engines here at Mercury Marine to tolerate and run on E10. When we go to E15, the situation is they'll tend to lean out and run hotter. And since we develop and produce some very high performance products, while the change seems small, we're very concerned about how relevant it may be. That will take its toll over time running E15.
Great. Thank you, Ed. The next question we have here relates to, I believe, some of the historical aspects of E10 when it first came out. And the question is this. The boating literature contains lots of statements about E10 causing deterioration of fiberglass fuel tanks, hoses, seals, and O-rings. If you gentlemen could elaborate on that, it would be appreciated.
Sure. Well, first of all, there was a lot of press coverage about the fiberglass fuel tanks. Those were in older boats, as I understand it, pre-1985 boats, and it's a relatively small population. The number I've heard repeatedly is about 50 boats were affected. As far as the things like seals and gaskets, we tend to get those parts from the same suppliers that supply to the auto industry, and the auto industry has for a long time mandated tolerance to E10. So until you get into very, very old engines, you really shouldn't see a problem there on E10. Now, you know, E15 would be a different story, but you should not see a degradation in seals and gaskets on E10 on most engines.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. And looking at the questions actually flooding in here right now, I can see that there is no way that we will be able to answer all of these questions. So what we will do is we will make sure to answer all of these questions either individually or through an avenue, again, which will communicate all of the answers here. So at that point, we'll continue answering questions for the next 10 minutes, but again, I apologize that there is no way that we can get to all of the questions.
Yeah, this is Ed again. I think we have to be careful. Before E10 was ever on the scene, we still had problems with fuel systems and fuel lines degrading. We have situations, I see some questions about fuel line degradation. We've had those, and in fact, at times there are problems with the quality of fuel lines, and they degrade. And really, the E10 has nothing, in effect, to do with it. Since probably the 70s, most of the fuel line materials you would buy at your local store, your AutoZone type store, are fine with E10 gasoline. I think some of the awareness that's come over time is that running E10 with a situation where phase separation occurs can result in maybe 50, a little more % alcohol mixed with water in the fuel system, and that combination can be fairly aggressive. Now here at Mercury, we've understood that for quite a while, and I'm not sure how well that is understood in some areas. So, you know, you got to be real careful about jumping on the alcohol in the fuel just because you're having a problem with fuel systems. Some of us people that are a little older, remember, we've always had problems with fuel systems long before E10 was the fuel in the tank. And the concern that I have about this is I'm very concerned when we have improper care or products that really aren't helping being put into fuel tanks when proper products aren't being used, because then there is damage to the engine and a warranty claim comes in and is taken care of by Mercury or other OEMs, quite frankly. We end up paying the warranty because our customer bought a product that really did nothing for him instead of using a product that really does the job. Not necessarily our products, but other products on the market that are honest products within the categories we've talked about that are used for good, solid fuel care and prevention of problems.
Great. Very good point, Ed. Thank you. The next question we have relates to transition from E0 to E10. The question is this. We have had E0 all summer, but will soon be getting E10 again. Are there any specific recommendations for those customers with fuel tanks half full of both types of fuel?
Well, I think if you look at the slide in the presentation where we talked about that, you really want to, if you're going from E0 to E10, you really want to get that fuel tank down as empty as possible before you add the E10. So you're adding as much alcohol as possible to the fuel tank, so you have your best chance to pick up the water that's going to be under the E0 fuel. It's a good idea, if possible, to pump the tank dry, and if you can get to an access port, get down and look into it and see how clean it looks. I mean, I know that's very difficult on a lot of boats to get at.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Next question relates to the new venting systems that are coming on the market. The question is this: will the new venting systems have any effect on the length of time before fuel will separate?
I'm not sure what fuel will separate means. Fuel doesn't separate.
The fuel phase separation.
The phase separation has nothing to do with time, really. If you've got E10 and you add enough water to it to exceed 0.5% by volume at 60 degrees, it will separate. Now, if you're seeing separation and time is involved, maybe more water is coming in over time, or the temperature is dropping over time, in which case it can spontaneously separate due to a drop in temperature, because the ability of the E10 to hold fuel dramatically drops with temperature. So fuel doesn't just separate. The alcohol and the gasoline are mixed together. The alcohol disperses in the gasoline, and it won't separate. Is that correct, Frank?
Yeah, that's right.
Frank's our chemical engineer, but the alcohol and the gasoline doesn't separate.
Right. The ethanol and gasoline should be compatible with each other to the extent that they do dissolve and should maintain that solubility. However, the problem comes when you get that third phase added, and that's water. And the ethanol and water have infinite solubility within each other, and the presence of water is what tends to want to pull the ethanol out of the solution.
Great. Thank you, Frank. Next question I have here relates to two-stroke engines. Everybody obviously wants to talk about the latest, greatest engine technology that's out there, but that's a very good question. And the question is this: how does E10 affect two-stroke oil, premixed or injected?
This is Ed again. Two-stroke oil already contains about 20% of a solvent. We usually call it Stoddard solvent, but it's a basic solvent to help it mix with gasoline. The ethanol in the gasoline really has no effect on the way the two-stroke oil will mix with the gasoline in a premix situation or in a injection situation. It shouldn't really have any effect.
Right. Yeah, this is Frank Kelly. I think there have been a lot of rumors, I would say, that involve ethanol and difficulty with lubricity as a result of using E10 with two-cycle oils. And the testing that I'm aware of, that I've seen, there's really no indication of lubricity problems as a result of that presence of ethanol.
Yeah, we run E10 in some of our test facilities, not all of our test facilities, but we test and develop engines with E10 fuel at Mercury Marine.
Very good. At this point, we have less than 5 minutes left, so we really only can take one more question. And the question is this, and it relates specifically to fuel lines, marine fuel lines, automotive fuel lines. And again, the question is as follows. The fuel line in the marine industry, I'm assuming, has to be Coast Guard approved or ABYC regulated. Using automotive fuel line is not allowed in the marine industry?
That is Correct. The fuel lines have to pass a fire test, and that's a unique Coast Guard test that automotive doesn't have to pass.
Yeah, in case of a fire on board a boat is much more severe, obviously, than on a car. Both are severe, but there is high sensitivity to fire on boats, and therefore the Coast Guard ABYC requirements are quite severe on that. It's got to be exposed to direct flame, I believe, for a period of time is that test. Much more severe than an automotive fuel line.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Well, at this point, we have to conclude our presentation. And I just want to follow up with saying that we really appreciate, again, everybody's time today. We know that everybody's very busy, but we hope that you found this a beneficial 60 minutes spent with us. So on behalf of Frank Kelly, Ed Alienek, Mark Rickers, and Heidi Stark, I thank you very much for your time today. And also keep in mind that we will be answering everybody's questions, and if any further questions are needed to be asked, please feel free to contact Heidi or myself at your convenience at the phone number or emails listed on the screen. So with that, thanks again. Appreciate your time, and take care.